Lights glowed inside, but the house stood empty. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. Share with me, where are you tuning in from? Your voices bring warmth to every mystery. Let's begin this one. I have often thought that Oxford is at her most revealing, not beneath the fierce July glare, nor even in the frost-bound stillness of January, but in that in-between hour when the streets grow damp and the lamps begin their reluctant watch. That evening in Jericho, the stones shone with a fine drizzle, soft as breath upon glass, and the air carried the slow organ practice of some unseen musician whose persistence was admirable, if not entirely tuneful. I had sought, as I often did, the half-light refugee of the Randolph Bar. A small crossword lay spread before me, my pen hesitating between two possible solutions that refused to align. 7 letters beginning with an L, ending with an E. The clue had teased at me all afternoon. Something to do with absence, or presence, or both. I ordered a whiskey and told myself it was the last for the day, though I had said that before. It was not the puzzle that held me long, but the drift of voices nearby. A waiter, balancing glasses with enviable poise, murmured to another that the lights in one of the faculty houses along Worcester Street had been burning night after night, curtains unclosed, a peculiar extravagance for so frugal a man. He said it almost in jest, a servant's anecdote passed to ease the monotony of service. Yet the details settled on me with unexpected weight, like the faint smell of gas where no flame should be. I had known the building he spoke of, a brick lodging with ivy retreating in patches, a place that once housed an archaeologist whose lectures had put many to sleep. The new tenant, I recalled vaguely, was a historian of some repute, though his name escaped me at the moment. The waiter laughed softly, remarking that either the fellow had more money than sense, or else had departed without switching off. His companion shrugged. They turned their talk to tips and tables, leaving me with the aftertaste of their remark. I sipped, staring into the amber glow of the glass. The crossword remained incomplete, and I considered the letters once more. 7 spaces waiting, like lit windows across a darkening square. A word formed briefly, then dissolved, perhaps the wrong grid entirely. The organ notes rose again, discordant, collapsing into silence, then resumed with fresh determination. I thought of the unseen student, or perhaps a tutor, unwilling to relinquish his buck, wrestling with harmony in an echoing chapel. Practice rooms and deserted staircases have always seemed to me curiously alike in spirit, half empty, yet clinging to purpose. The waiter returned. Did I want another? His voice was respectful, but certain that I did. I declined, though I envied his certainty. As he cleared the table beside me, I asked without much intention whether he meant the lodging with the carved lintel near the corner of Worcester Place. He nodded, surprised that I knew it. Yes, that was the one. Always bright as day, he said, though no sound, no shadow, no soul ever visible within. I folded the paper and slipped the pen into my pocket. The crossword would wait, as most things do. Yet the image remained, a house, conspicuous not by darkness but by an overabundance of light, like a theatre in which the actors had failed to appear. In my experience, few things are more eloquent than absence. I left the Randolph with the faint impression of whiskey still on my breath, the damp air cooling it away. The rain had eased, though the stones of Beaumont Street shone as if they would never dry. Students hurried past, their scarves clutched close, their laughter brief and brittle. A bus hissed along the curb. Across the street, a single lamp flared and flickered before regaining its composure. I walked without destination, though my steps inclined toward Jericho. Curiosity, not yet suspicion. A detail overheard, stored for later. And yet I knew myself too well. Certain remarks are never stored for later. They are seeds that insist on growth, however barren the soil. When I reached the canal bridge, I paused, leaning upon the rail. The water below caught what light it could, uncertain of whether to reflect or to consume it. In that wavering mirror, I considered the waiter's words. Lights that burn without reason in a house where no one seems to dwell. Perhaps nothing at all, perhaps everything. I turned back toward my rooms with the faintest suggestion of an answer to the crossword, teasing at the edge of thought. 7 letters beginning with L, ending with E. The clue, home, yet not at home. I wrote it silently in the air with a finger damp from rain. Lodge. The lights, I thought, were on. And perhaps, as so often in Oxford, no one was home. Lewis collected me near Worcester Street with the patience of a man who trusts routine more than hunch. The porter had rung again, lights burning, blinds careless, the house too awake for its hour. We walked the short distance, shoes whispering over wet grit. The front door stood ajar by a finger's width, the sort of lapse a neat man would resent. I pushed with 2 knuckles. The latch yielded. Light flooded the narrow hall. The air was warm and stale in the way of rooms that believe their owners will return. Lewis took the ground floor. I stood, hearing a clock that was not there. Old houses invent heartbeats. On the console table lay an unaddressed envelope, a red-corded key ring, and spectacles folded as if for a short nap. We called the tenant's name with neighbourly restraint. Dr. Sebastian Vale did not answer. The staircase rose in a tight timber curve, the handrail polished by cautious hands. Halfway up, a door on the landing wore a brass hasp and an old mortice lock, the wood bearing the soft shine of recent use. The rooms beyond were alert with electricity, kitchen light, bathroom light, bedrooms bright as an examination hall. Yet nothing stirred. A glass on a sideboard held the sweet ghost of sherry. The meniscus trembled at our step. On a gentlemanly desk lay a single page, the pen abandoned. The letter began formal, moved to impatience, then, as the ink thinned, to something I will not call fear. He had written that it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, and I knew at once he had borrowed the line and bent it. The cadence stumbled. He had dropped the small but necessary too. No scholar misquotes Tennyson so lazily. Lewis returned with the facts he keeps like cutlery. No struggle, no coat missing, shoes where shoes should be, bed unmade, as if morning had been cancelled. He disliked hazy explanations. Why the lights, sir? Why the door? Why the waste? The sherry was recent, perhaps an hour or two, the smell still confident. A man alone does not pour an expensive glass to leave it breathing. Lewis said perhaps he was called away. I thought of the unfinished sentence with its wounded rhythm and suggested that he had called himself away or been persuaded to do so. The locked door resisted kindly. I felt for a spare key along the skirting where careful people hide them and found dust and one dry spider. The lock itself was old but confiding, a thin blade and a slower hand, and, with a sigh like a church cushion, it yielded. Lewis watched as though I had committed a small sin he could forgive later. Inside, books. The room smelled of paper and the faint colder scent of an unused hearth. Vale's order was scholarly rather than tidy. Shelves were lines of thought interrupted by holidays. A narrow window looked onto brick. On the sill, a dried ivy leaf had been raised by a draught and lay turned, pale side up. There was no body, no note, no rage disguised as explanation. Only that page, the bruised quotation, and the lights insisting on company. I touched the pen and found it cool. I lifted the blotter and saw a crossword begun with discipline and marred by one confident mistake. Home defined as lodge, where the enumeration required 7. The wrong shape fitted until one listened to the counting. We left as we had entered, with the house glaring behind and the drizzle renewing its grudge. On the step, Lewis said daylight would be kinder. I agreed, although night had told us more, that a man with tidy habits had misquoted the poet he knew best, and that a locked door had preferred to be opened from within tonight. Oxford has its share of scholars who wear their loneliness like a second gown, and Sebastian Vale was one of them. His reputation had preceded him long before I first stepped into his house. A man of letters, they said, a chronicler of medieval exiles, as if the subject matter had been chosen not from scholarly curiosity, but from recognition of his own condition. In the colleges his name was recalled with a shrug, brilliant perhaps, but argumentative, the sort who mistook combat for discourse. Some claimed he had been working these past months on a manuscript designed to shame his contemporaries by rewriting the history they had long cherished. Others said the project was imaginary, a mirage invented to excuse his retreat. The house itself offered little contradiction. Books lined the walls with the authority of centuries, but their dust suggested he read them more often with his memory than his eyes. There was no clutter of family photographs, no careless sprawl of gifts or letters, only an orderliness that felt brittle rather than serene. I have known rooms where one is certain laughter once lived, and rooms where it never tried. His belonged to the latter. I found the housekeeper in the kitchen, a woman of the kind who remembers every date but not every hour. She had last seen him 3 days before, carrying in his tray with the usual glass of sherry. He had thanked her absently, eyes on a notebook, and dismissed her until the following morning. When she returned, he was gone. She had cleaned around the silence, waiting for its explanation, but none arrived. She had not touched the desk. She said this with a firmness that implied both duty and fear. She described him without affection, but without malice, a man who enjoyed disputation more than company, who corrected her grammar without apology, who once asked her opinion on a passage of Latin only to tell her why it was wrong. Yet she said he never missed the evening ritual of piano practice, the same pieces repeated, the same faltering endings. Chopin, she thought, though she admitted she could not tell. 3 nights ago the sound ceased. She had noticed because her sleep had grown used to it, and silence, like light, has its own weight. I asked the neighbours, and their recollections matched hers. Vale's piano was as dependable as the tolling of Tom Tower. Students on their way to Jericho pubs had marked the music as a kind of local landmark, sometimes mocked, sometimes envied. One neighbour said she had caught glimpses of him through the open window, head bent, back curved, as if the act of playing was not for pleasure, but for atonement. The abrupt cessation of this music struck them all as uncanny. Absence, again, speaking louder than presence. Back inside, I stood at his desk. The wine-glass still waited with a half measure. Sherry, sweet, heavy, clinging to the bowl. Not fresh, but not yet sour. To pour and not drink is a small betrayal of habit. One does not prepare a comfort, and then abandon it without cause. The ink on the unfinished letter had dried to a dull sheen, its last line tapering into nothing. The words were there, but they had lost their authority, as if Vale had faltered mid-thought, and left both pen and glass in mutual reproach. Lewis said perhaps he had simply gone away. Scholars, he added, were known for absent-mindedness, but Vale's mind, I felt sure, had not been absent. It had been diverted. There is a difference. The misquoted Tennyson still scratched at me. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, except he had written it otherwise. Such a man would not stumble accidentally. He had been signalling something, to whom I could not yet say. I carried the glass to the window, where rain traced its patient diagonals across the pane. The sherry trembled with each step, catching the lamplight in reluctant glimmers. A man gone 3 days, a piano silenced, a line of poetry bent out of shape. It seemed to me that the glass, abandoned in its half state, was less a drink than a marker of interruption, an object halted in time. And I, standing there, could not help feeling that his absence was not sudden at all, but rehearsed, like the quiet pause at the end of a piece he had played too many times before. I met Professor Margaret Cleave in a room that had the sour after-smell of coffee and debate. Her books stood like enlisted ranks, their dust jackets guarded by glass. She greeted me with the technical kindness academics reserve for inquisitors. She said Sebastian Vale was brilliant and intolerable, a man who sharpened his mind upon other people's work. He had taught her clarity by dismantling her arguments until only the bones were left. She smiled as if bones were an achievement. She spoke briskly as if a syllabus had to be covered by the hour. Vale had enemies, she allowed, but enemies are merely colleagues without patience. He had been working, she thought, on a study that would not be kind to certain venerable reputations. I asked whether her own was among them. She let the pause sit. She said he admired her Latin and distrusted her conclusions. He was not sentimental, she added, except about accuracy. There was an odd neatness in her office that did not quite persuade. A tulip in a jar had been trimmed with the severity one gives to deadlines. While she talked, she circled back to the idea of jealousy, not her own, of course, but the universal condition of Oxford. She described Vale's habit of rehearsing arguments at the piano, left hand marking time, right hand sketching a grudging melody. She had once told him his taste for Chopin was perverse. He replied that Chopin understood failure better than a... She did not ask about the misquoted Tennyson. I did not offer it. When I said his lights had burned for days, she looked past me at the college quad, as though the stone might speak in her defence. Then very gently she said he was not a man easily interrupted, which was another way of saying she doubted he had been interrupted at all. From there I went to Jericho, where Mrs. Diana Ashcroft kept a small house and a larger garden. Widowhood suited her in the way certain coats fit better after the weather turns. She showed me along the gravel path that Vale had once praised for being too neat. She called him scholarly with the soft mockery that forgives little and forgets less. He watched my roses, she said, the way men watch trains they are not boarding. In her sitting room, the air carried the faintest perfume of leaf mould and polish. She remembered the evening piano as others remember bells. Sometimes he played a phrase again and again until it surrendered. Sometimes he stopped mid-bar and never returned. She wondered aloud whether a heart can mislay its rhythm before the body does. I said, hearts mislay everything. She spoke of small courtesies, a book left on her step, a note pretending to ask advice, the kind of overture a lonely man makes toward the border of conversation without crossing it. I asked if he had crossed it. She said borders are easier to keep when both parties believe in maps. When I left, the late light caught upon a watering can beside the steps, filled but unused. I thought of his glass of sherry, half begun, and the surviving scent of music. Cleave had spoken of jealousy and rigour. Ashcroft offered gardens and the patient labour of afternoons. Together they formed a portrait whose chin and eyes agreed, while the mouth refused. My deduction, if it was one, arrived by the smallest road. Neither woman said a word about the letter on the desk, though both had reason to know of it. Either they did not, which seemed unlikely, or they had chosen absence as their alibi. The silence between their sentences, like the pause between piano phrases, had the shape of something remembered too carefully. Oxford keeps such silences for us. We only decide whether to hear them at all tonight. I have never trusted tidy shelves. They present themselves as innocent order, but I have found that where books align too precisely, one often discovers a misfit lurking, a page that has waited too long for the wrong eyes. It was in Vale's study that I traced my finger along the spines of Horace, Virgil, Catullus, Latin consolations for a man who liked the company of the dead. One volume gave with less resistance, as if it had been invited to reveal. I opened it, and a letter, folded into neat thirds, slid to the carpet with a whisper. Lewis picked it up, held it with a constable's indifference, and passed it across. He said it looked like the usual, another scholar's quarrel disguised as correspondence. But the paper was heavier than the college standard, and the ink a little too careful, as if the writer had rehearsed. I read it once through and found myself dissatisfied. The tone was curious, phrases shaped like accusation yet cloaked in courtesy. It began with the assurance that Vale would not be judged too harshly if he complied. It warned that the truth, once revealed, would not only harm him, but also disturb others who deserved their peace. No demand for money, no explicit instruction. Only a suggestion that compliance, unspecified, was expected. Lewis asked if it was blackmail. The word sat badly. Blackmail has a vulgar directness. This was something more insidious, almost polite in its cruelty. It reminded me of those college notices that announce with perfect grammar that all joy must cease by midnight. The cadence unsettled me. I read it again, slower. The rhythm of the sentences was off, as though a Latinist had written English with an alien ear. Certain phrases carried the weight of translation, not creation. Vale, of course, would have recognized that at once. He would have known the hand behind it, or at least the mind. And he had folded it carefully and placed it within Horace, the poet of measured consolation, the one who advises us to seize the day while keeping an eye on the grave. Lewis watched me, his patience fraying. He said if it wasn't blackmail, what was it? I told him it was a veiled threat of exposure. Exposure of what? He asked. And I had to admit I did not yet know. A past scandal, perhaps? Oxford breeds them as nettles breed in neglected gardens. Old disputes over authorship, stolen research, a misused grant. Or something more personal. Affections that had strayed where convention disapproves. What struck me most was what it did not say. No figure, no meeting place, no demand to destroy papers or sign confessions. It assumed that Vale would understand. Letters like that only work when sender and recipient share the ghost already. I looked again at the hand. It was careful, but oddly characterless, the sort of writing that disguises rather than reveals. I thought of the two women I had spoken with, the one who defended him through her teeth, the other who remembered him with reluctant tenderness, both intelligent, both capable of disguises. But the rhythm here suggested a scholar's mind. Lewis said perhaps Vale had imagined it, written it himself to justify his disappearance. I shook my head. The cadence was too foreign, the malice too impersonal. Vale, for all his quarrels, had precision. He would not have tolerated such clumsy music. I placed the letter back between Horace's pages and closed the book. I told Lewis we must assume it meant more than it declared. He said I was chasing shadows. Perhaps. But shadows in Oxford are often cast by solid things. When I left the study that evening, the rain had begun again, fine and persistent, stitching the quad into a grey fabric. I thought of Vale unfolding the letter, reading it twice and placing it in the company of Horace. He had not hidden it deep, only tucked it where it might be found by someone who shared his habit of curiosity. Perhaps it was meant for me, though I would never flatter myself with such destiny. What remained was the silence between its lines, the absence of a demand. Demands are vulgar, silences are deadly. The news arrived between those thin Oxford showers that begin with apology and end with persistence. Lewis had the message. A solicitor on St. Aldate's wished to discuss the testamentary intentions of Dr. Sebastian Vale, revised not long before the lights began their obstinate watch. Lewis said it sounded tidy. I distrust tidy. Fenwick and Hargreaves, the brass plate read. Inside, corridors smelt of ledgers, damp umbrellas, and a modest pride in procedure. Mr. Fenwick presented himself with the careful warmth of a man who respects ink more than feeling. He said there had been a codicil, 2 weeks old, witnessed within these very rooms. He said everything was in order, in good conscience. The surprise lay not in the bequests to library and college, but in a sum directed toward a former student. One Julian Pine, unplaced, unpromoted, somewhere between promise and disappearance. He slid a copy across the table. I let my eyes wander past totals and residuary clauses to a line appended beneath the signatures, an ornament of Latin, presumably meant to confer austere dignity. Fortes, fortuna docent. The small jolt I felt was the sort a musician feels when a familiar hymn swerves by a semitone. Fortune teaches the brave, a construction both graceless and wrong. Vale had prized precision. He would sooner leave a glass half full than a motto half made. Lewis suggested humour. Vale could be dry, he said. Fenwick shifted in his chair, mildly affronted by the imputation of error within his walls. Scholars, he ventured, are entitled to peculiarities in their own hand. I asked if the phrase had ever appeared in earlier papers. Number? I asked about the witnesses. A secretary with neat penmanship, a clerk devoted to the blotter. Tuesday, mid-morning, rain on the panes, everything calm. The hand itself troubled me. Vale's racing script ran through the body. The motto arrived in a slower, rounded shape, as though a diligent student had been trying to impress a tired examiner. It echoed the same tone that rasped in the anonymous letter in Horace. A courtesy slightly off-key, a cadence mistranslated from another language of thought. If you counterfeit the mind, the ear betrays you. We asked about Pine. Fenwick produced a file thin enough to encourage despair. Good undergraduate performance, a stuttered postgraduate start, small debts, a tenancy near the station. Nothing felonious, nothing durable. Vale had once interceded on his behalf for a college hardship fund. The connection cooled. As connections do, we left with copies and the reprimand of a wet street. Lewis said the new bequest explained some quarrel that had toppled slowly toward reconciliation. I said reconciliation does not misspell itself. He grunted that Latin scholars are allowed their flourishes. I said scholars reserve their flourishes for anyone's documents but their own. Back in my rooms, I laid the codicil beside the courteous threat from Horace and let the papers regard one another. A misquoted poet, a mismanaged proverb. 2 slips, each small enough to be forgiven, together too symmetrical to ignore. Vale's vanity was exactness. Someone had borrowed his name and returned it untidily. Could the alteration be a forgery? The signatures behaved, the witnesses looked wholesome on paper, the stamps impressed their small authority. Yet respectable frauds travel with immaculate company. The path the document offered us, toward an obscure young man and an act of belated charity, seemed almost indecently straight. I have been misled by Strater. I slept fitfully and woke twice with the phrase turning in my head, wrong in the same reliable way, like a door that always sticks on the last inch. Fortes fortuna docent, a lesson when we were promised favour. Somewhere between Fenwick's orderly room and Vale's half-finished glass, the Latin had slipped. That was how the first false trail opened, with rain at the sash and the quiet discomfort of a scholar's wince. I went to the Sheldonian that night out of habit rather than hunger. Opera can rescue a day, if one lets it, but I found myself counting lamps along Broad Street as if the music would be more tolerable once the city had been inventoried. Inside, the hall glowed with that old ceremonial warmth, a warmth that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with tradition. Robes in the portraits looked down as if we had arrived late to our own trial. The overture did what overtures do, promised coherence. Violins argued courteously, the brass explained itself, a chorus appeared like history. I tried to lean back into it, but Vale's letter kept nudging at the bar lines. When a tenor pleaded for mercy, I heard only the careful cruelty of anonymous ink. I watched the conductor's small empire of wrists and thought of the lights in Worcester Street burning without audience. At the interval, I drifted along the balcony where people pretend to love one another for 4 minutes. Margaret Cleeve materialized with a glass that looked as if it had been poured to the line. She said he adored Verdi, poor Sebastian. He could recite the plots with the relish of a parish priest. I agreed politely because the lie was not aimed at me. Then I excused myself and walked to a window where the night had cooled to the colour of pewter. He despised Italian opera. I had heard it from the man himself one late afternoon when the Sheldonian steps were rinsed clean by rain. All that gesturing, he had said, the melodrama of it, give me Bach's mathematics, Morse. He had smiled at his own pedantry and declined an invitation to La Traviata with a remark about cheerful diseases. He had not been a man to adore Verdi. Cleeve's memory had placed affection where he had kept disdain. I went back to her with the small curiosity of a collector approaching a misprinted stamp. I said she must have known him well to speak of his private tastes. She returned the ball without effort. One lives long enough in Oxford, and everyone's preferences become public property. That was the point at which she looked away too early, the way a good liar looks away before the truth arrives to be contradicted. She asked whether I liked this production. I said I did not know yet. She smiled as if that were the only answer I ever gave. Lewis found me at the tail of the queue for coffee. He said a call had come through. Vale's car had been located near the Thames by a riverside inn with a view that had made poets sentimental and publicans solvent. Abandoned, his word, not mine. The landlord remembered nothing useful, as landlords do when they are deciding whether usefulness has a surcharge. The keys were not in the ignition. The seat was adjusted for a taller man. There was a parking receipt folded into the visor with yesterday's date. We stood in an alcove that smelt of varnish and old celebrations. Lewis asked whether I wished to leave at once. I told him the music would forgive us. He said music forgives everything. I said yes, but not instantly. We agreed to remain until the interval shuddered to its close, because sudden exits attract eyes in the wrong places. The second half began, and the soprano sang as if all sorrow could be addressed by high notes. I watched the conductor's hand mark time for grief. In my head, the car waited beside water, a mute guest at the wrong table. I imagined the landlord's ledger, the hurried hand, the easy lie practiced into innocence. I imagined the inn's corridor with its carpet that never allowed a footstep to be solitary. And behind it all, Cleeve's remark wrapped like ribbon around a gift that didn't fit the box. A small deduction then, but lit from within. Either she had spoken carelessly, rare for her, or she had been closer to Vale than even she intended to confess, close enough to dress his distastes as devotion when they became awkward. People do that for the dead and sometimes for the absent. It is a way of rehearsing possession. When the curtain finally showed mercy, we walked out into a night that had learned restraint. The bells argued briefly and gave up. I told Lewis to take the car down to the river while I walked. He said the inn's name without enthusiasm, a name that pretended to be rustic and had earned it. I said I would meet him by the bridge, and that he should note the registration numbers of every vehicle that looked as if it had been waiting too politely. He nodded, already thinking of tyres on wet lanes. Of the performance I remember little now, except that it continued without me, obedient to its own logic. Some evenings are like that in Oxford. The music proceeds, the audience applauds, the city dresses itself for ceremony, and a single sentence, he adored Verdi, poor Sebastian, keeps playing in one's head long after the orchestra has put away its grief. The Riverside Inn had that damp serenity which publicans cultivate with polished brass and an excess of curtains. Rain lingered on the beams, making the place smell of cider and mildew. The landlord received us with the defensive cordiality of a man who believes the police never arrive for anything simple. He said yes, he remembered Vale, professor, doctor, something academic, here not long ago. He had been at a corner table, deep in talk with a younger fellow. Animated was the word he chose, as though Vale had been roused from his habitual dusk. Kiss asked for a description. The landlord, enjoying his moment, spoke of a pale face, brown hair cut too carefully, a jacket that tried to be expensive. It could have been half the undergraduates in Oxford, but it resembled closely enough the file photograph we had seen of Julian Pine, the obscure legatee of the altered will. Lewis looked satisfied, as if a puzzle had consented to its solution. I could not share the relief. The table Vale had supposedly used bore no special sign of his presence, only the circular ghosts of glasses wiped clean. Still I ran a hand along the wood, as though some residual trace might yield itself. Nothing did. Lewis pressed, "Could the landlord be sure?" The man nodded vigorously. "Certain," he said. He knew the younger chap came from the colleges. He remembered the way Vale had raised his voice once, not in anger, but in insistence, and the younger man had bent forward as if under instruction. Later that evening we found Pine in a library carrel, head bent over a ledger, the kind of silence one wears like armour. He looked startled at the intrusion, then wary. He said he had not been to that inn in months. His time was divided between the Bodleian, the Ashmolean, and his small flat. When shown the landlord's recollection, he smiled with a mixture of pity and contempt. He said memory is a poor witness, and he had proof. He slid across the attendance record for that evening, a tutorial register signed in his hand, witnessed by his supervisor. The hour overlapped with the supposed meeting. Lewis muttered that Vale might have gone twice, or that Pine's signature could have been arranged after the fact. Pine replied coldly that his supervisor's hand could not be forged so lightly. The words were true enough, and the alibi, however inconvenient, seemed ironclad. Back outside, the dusk bruised itself along the river. I told Lewis the scene at the inn may have been staged. Vale, with some other young man of similar build, chosen precisely for the resemblance. The landlord, eager to assist, had supplied the rest. Lewis grew restless at such speculation. He said every time we came near ground I lifted us back into mist. He wanted firm edges. I told him Oxford never offers them. We walked along the towpath, the river sluggish with weeds, lamps flickering in hesitant reflection. I considered the possibility that Vale had arranged the meeting himself to mislead whoever came asking, an elaborate deception or a desperate one. The problem with red herrings is not that they deceive, but that they swim so naturally among truths. At one point, I bent to retrieve a crumpled scrap of paper lodged between the slats of the inn's bench, a crossword clipping smudged by damp. 3 clues filled, 1 error glaring, the Latin for fate rendered as fortuna, not fatum, clumsy and wrong in precisely the way Vale would never allow. I tucked it into my pocket, perhaps nothing, perhaps echo. Lewis asked if I truly believed Pine was innocent. I told him innocence is a word for courts. We were still in the country of shadows. He groaned, lit a cigarette, and said one of these days my love for shadows would drown me. I said perhaps. We stood then, 2 figures by the water, listening to the faint applause of rain on the river's skin. Somewhere a bell argued with itself and gave up. And I thought again of the landlord's eager certainty, the young man's cold dismissal, the half-correct crossword clue. 3 shapes of truth, each refusing to stand beside the others. I returned to Vale's study as one returns to a place that has issued a challenge without raising its voice. The air kept its mixture of paper and sherry. I sat at the desk and slid open the shallow drawer I had ignored before. The crossword lay there like a test no one had marked. Not a newspaper grid, but one clipped and recopied in his hand, the clues rearranged as if argument were geometry. Across, down, small triumphs, small irritations. My eye stopped at a 7-letter slot filled with the assurance that exposes itself. Home, yet not at home. 7. He had written lodgers, the plural shouted. The clue wanted singularity. The count demanded 1 life wearing 2 addresses. It was wrong, and wrong with intent. Lewis stood behind me with the virtue of patience. He said a slip is a slip. I said a slip that salutes you is no slip. I rubbed the paper until the fibres lifted, and beneath the graphite I could discern earlier letters, a hesitant attempt at exile that stalled at 5. He had tried the obvious before deciding upon the mistake he wished seen. On a notebook lay the abandoned title of his monograph, Exile and Return in English History. The words twinned themselves in the room, exile and return, home and not at home, a theme repeated until it forgets whether it is truth or habit. Vale wanted someone to read this grid and know he was living the title as well as writing it. I thought of the misquoted Tennyson in his unfinished letter. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, except he had bent it delicately. Love mislaid and love renounced are cousins that decline to recognize one another. The wrongness there had the same calm as the wrongness here. Lewis said the will troubled him less. Money prefers clarity. I said clarity can be cultivated, hedges cut to look like animals. The Latin motto beneath the codicil, that graceless fortes fortuna docent, had been a second wrongness. A Latinist would sweat before writing it or laugh after. Here in the grid was the same hand, signalling with a left glove while hiding the right. If you plan one false step, make another to steady it. Tennyson misremembered, proverb mismanaged, crossword deliberately misfit. I tried answers in my head the way a choir tests a new vowel. Outdwell came and went. Absence refused the definition. Unhoused carried a thud. Then I saw what he had meant to leave. Hostage. A hostage is home and not at home. A hostage is present yet, claimed by elsewhere. A hostage is the emblem of exile and return. The crossings permitted it if one accepted 2 wrong entries elsewhere, also smudged, also bold. He had built a message by calculated inelegance. Lewis said I was inventing. Perhaps. Invention, handled carefully, can disclose more than fact allowed to idle. I traced the path, the courteous threat tucked in Horace, the codicil with counterfeit Latin. This grid with its plural mistake. Each pointed not at Pine, but at the mind that knew Vale's habits and wished to copy them without learning the music. I closed the drawer and switched off the lamps in every room. The dark felt correct rather than theatrical. In the hall, a creak reported the house settling around its absence. Lewis asked whether we were closer. I said that the wrong answers had begun to rhyme. Outside, the quad kept its grid of light, windows alternating like squares that could be stepped without drowning. Rain freckled the paving. I walked on, thinking of hostages, of rooms that keep their brightness for no one, and of a man who left his last clue where even a dull policeman might find it, provided he learned to read the error before the solution. I went to the archives in that hour when the library smells most like rain-soaked wool and old glue. The porter nodded with the proprietary pity of men who have seen too many scholars come looking for absolution in cardboard boxes. A clerk produced the ledger, then the carton, then the envelope within the carton, each layer announcing itself with the whisper of paper that has learned discretion. The photograph lay between two acid-stained sheets, the emulsion browned into the colour of tea. 8 men stood outside a chapel door. Vale was there, younger, but already a little apart, his smile practised into reticence. Beside him a taller figure, the hands too elegant for comfort, and behind them a cluster of faces wearing that curious academic hope which resembles disdain at a distance. Sebastian Vale. Arthur Cleeve. I took the photo to the long table and leaned under the green shade of the lamp. It is a truth of archives that illumination is always partial. I read the surrounding correspondence, letters written on the type of thick paper a man chooses when he wishes history to support him. An article had appeared, signed by Vale, arguing an audacious correction to a medieval charter. Another letter, unsigned, asserted that the idea had first been spoken by Cleeve in seminar, then borrowed in the Civil Way theft. There were no accusations in the file, only arrangements, a visiting post for Cleeve that never materialized, a reference from Vale full of generous praise that never quite said the necessary. Then the abrupt halt of correspondence, as if a clock had been told to hold its breath. The scandal, if that mild name can be trusted, had been domesticated into silence. Cleeve married, taught dutifully, published little. Vale advanced, not swiftly, not cleanly. I looked, again at the photograph. Vain men fix themselves to history by altering where they stand. Vale hovered at the edge, not ashamed, but strategic. Cleeve, by contrast, faced the camera squarely, as if daring it to attempt fidelity. Between them ran a space capable of swallowing a career. Someone had placed a fingerprint in the margin many years ago, a dark oval like a mislaid syllable. I asked the clerk about the provenance of the file. He said it had been consulted quite recently in the last term. A female reader, the initials recorded in an obedient hand, M.C. The letters walked across the page with a confidence that did not recognize irony. Margaret Cleeve had looked then, and not casually. She had followed the chain to the same table, the same lamp, the same tea-coloured faces. Perhaps she had turned the photograph as I did, searching for a way to disprove its quiet. Perhaps she had seen that the future of her father's name had been squeezed into the white margin where nobody writes. I thought of Vale's misquoted Tennyson, the counterfeit Latin under the codicil, the crossword that had chosen the wrong answer with ceremony, errors that understood precision. He was being answered in his own language by someone who had learned it painfully. Hostage, I had decided, and now the hostage came into focus, not the man, but reputation. Lewis joined me, boots sodden, patience thinner than the paper on which the past pretends to behave. He wanted a charge sheet. The archive offered atmospheres. I told him the present case began 30 years ago with a theft that never admitted itself. He said theft is theft, whether whispered or sung. I said Oxford prefers the whisper. On my way out, I paused beneath the clerestory where dust performs for the faithful. The photograph remained in my head like an after-image. Vale had not been silenced for what he was doing now. He had been recalled to pay for what he had taken then, and somewhere a daughter had decided the invoice was still unpaid. It was late when I asked her to meet me, and she chose the college rooms that had once belonged to her father. The corridor smelt of dust and radiator heat, the kind that dries the throat but never warms the bone. She stood by the window with the curtains unclosed, the lamps burning too brightly for honesty. She said I had come to accuse her, and I told her I had come to listen. Her voice was composed, almost lecturing. Vale had not been murdered, she began, not even threatened. He had come to her one evening, anxious, carrying the weight of papers he should never have kept. They were her father's, she said, or rather they should have been. Vale had taken the idea, made it his own, published, prospered. Her father had been left with silence, and she had inherited that silence like a debt. Vale, perhaps sensing the past would not remain buried, had come with his explanations. He collapsed in the chair before he could finish them. A stroke, she said, sudden, merciless, almost banal in its certainty. She had stood over him, too calm, too slow, and then too quick. She had thought of scandal, of her father's name, of her own place in the Academy's long memory. Panic is sometimes neat. She had carried him back to his own rooms with the help of no one. She had left the lights burning so the house might pretend to be alive. I said the forgery of the will was clumsy. She smiled at that, the smile of a pupil who accepts correction. She admitted she had asked a younger man, not Pine, but another, to produce it. The distraction served. If Vale's name was already wavering, a further tangle of scandal might obscure the older theft. She had counted on our appetite for the simple explanation: money, resentment, youth. I told her the smallest errors betrayed her. The Tennyson misquoted, the Latin motto bruised, the crossword misfilled. She said she had tried to copy his precision, but found precision too heavy a burden. And then she asked, almost lightly, whether I thought she had killed him. I said no. She said then we were at an impasse. Her eyes were not defiant. They were tired, the eyes of someone who has rehearsed justifications too often. She asked whether the truth would help her father now. I said the truth is not a gift to the dead. She said then it was only punishment for the living. Lewis waited in the quad where the lamps shone on wet stone. I told him she had confessed. He asked, to what? I said, concealment. He asked if that was enough. I said it was too much and not enough. We walked back in silence, the kind that does not mend. In my mind I saw Vale's house with every lamp blazing, a stage waiting for actors who had forgotten their lines. The glass of sherry, the unfinished letter, the crossword clue, each was a candle lit against discovery, and yet it was light itself that condemned her. I cannot say whether I pitied her. She had carried her father's grievance like an heirloom, and had chosen to burn it into brightness rather than let it rest in dust. A stroke had ended the man, but it was the past that had ended her. That night I poured a whiskey and sat with the crossword Vale had left behind. Hostage, 7 letters, home, yet not at home. I thought of him, of her, of myself. The lights were on, but no one was home. By the time the papers found their appetite, the city had learned the taste. Vale became a headline, then a footnote, then a silence scholars stepped around. The college issued a statement whose commas were immaculate. The archive shut its box. I signed things. Lewis signed more. In the end, there was only the city and its weather. I walked after dark again, because Oxford is kinder in reflection than in daylight. Rain had rinsed the stones and left the streets shining with that frail arrogance the town wears when the term has thinned. On Park's Road, a porter swept leaves in a rhythm like a metronome, deciding against time. A cyclist hurried past, his lamp a brief consolation. Somewhere, the organist persisted with a line he could not settle. Cleeve resigned with the dignity of someone who understands how to arrange endings. She did not ask for leniency. She wrote one letter to the board and another to me, saying little and meaning less, as if brevity might carry grace. Her father's name would not be restored, her own would blur along the margin. She said Oxford is a ledger that never balances. Vale's house dimmed at last, every bulb obeying a logic that had arrived late. The piano remained closed. The sherry, decanted from its half-life, perfumed the sink before surrendering to the drain. I signed a release for the body that felt more like a conclusion. On the desk, the crosswords still waited, the wrong letters holding their small, stubborn ground. I left them. Lewis and I stood again by the river where the inn kept its windows fat with light. He said we had done what could be done, and I did not argue. He said the young man would be left alone, and I said that was a kindness disguised as indifference. He said people would forget, and I said forgetting is another way of keeping. I made a small deduction then, the sort that belongs to no case file. A street lamp at the edge of Worcester Street throws two shadows upon the pavement when rain is present, and only one when the air is dry. I had seen two during the week of Vale's absence, even on nights when the rain had ended hours before. The explanation is dull and sufficient. The shop across the way had installed a second light at dusk. Yet I had made a tale of those shadows, and the tale had carried me. Near midnight I reached the Randolph. The doorman nodded in the way of men who have learned to recognize other people's ghosts without greeting them. The lobby was a pool of warmth. Beyond the glass, Broad Street kept its careful chill. I watched taxis idle and depart, each meter beginning again, as if the last journey had taught nothing. In the bar, a woman laughed and then, remembering herself, did not. Lewis found me and asked what I had said a moment before. I had not realized I had spoken. Perhaps I had repeated the line Vale mangled in his last letter. Perhaps I had attempted to return it to sense. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, the mind supplies. But the voice, grown wary, declines to recite. I shook my head. He did not press. I kept walking after he left, the damp finding its way through my coat, the familiar ache returning to its seat. Knowledge, I reminded myself, is a solvent more potent than grief. It unmans and it dries. By the time I turned back toward my rooms, the streets had settled into their old posture, the lamps obedient again, the rain demoted to rumour. I paused once more and waited for the city to answer, and, as ever, it refused. The lights were on, no one was home,